The corn was still wet with morning dew when Eleanor Marsh walked out of the tree line and onto Route 9, barefoot and blinking like someone returning from another world. The sun hadn't fully committed to rising yet. It hung low and pale behind a shelf of clouds, casting the kind of gray, directionless light that makes everything look like a photograph of itself. The road was empty in both directions. Just cracked asphalt, a rusted guardrail, and the sound of wind moving through the fields like a slow exhale. Cal Briggs had been driving that stretch of Route 9 for 11 years. He knew every pothole, every dead skunk, every crooked mile marker between the highway junction and the Crestfield grain depot. He drove it half asleep most mornings, his left hand on the wheel and his right wrapped around a thermos of burnt coffee that his wife packed every night before bed. He had the radio tuned low to a country station out of Lexington, something slow and pedal steel heavy that he wasn't really listening to. His mind was on the load behind him, on whether the depot scales were running slow again, on the fact that his youngest had a school play that evening and he'd actually promised this time, that he'd make it. He saw her from about 200 yards out. At first his brain filed her under deer, something pale and still at the edge of the headlights, reach, standing where nothing human had any business standing at 5 in the morning. Then the shape resolved. 2 legs, arms loose at her sides. A curtain of dark hair hanging lank around a pale face. She wasn't walking. She wasn't waving. She was simply standing in the center of the road, looking directly at his truck as if she had been expecting it. Cal's foot hit the brake hard enough to slosh coffee across the passenger seat and send his thermos clattering to the floor. The rig shuddered and groaned, tires biting into the asphalt with a sound like tearing paper. He came to a stop about 20 feet from her. Close enough that his headlights lit her up completely. This girl in a torn flannel shirt that was 2 sizes too big, jeans that were stiff with dried mud at the knees, feet bare and dark with road grime. She didn't flinch at the lights. Didn't step back. She just stood there, blinking slowly, like someone waking up from a dream so deep that the real world still hadn't quite taken hold. Cal sat in the cab for a moment, heart hammering, one hand still gripping the wheel. Then he set the brake, pushed open the door, and climbed down. The morning air hit him cold and smelled like turned earth and something faintly sweet. The last of the season's corn rotting gently in the fields. His boots crunched on the asphalt as he walked toward her. He kept his hands visible, his voice low, the same way he'd approach a spooked animal. "Hey there," he said. "You all right?" She looked at him. Her eyes were dark and very steady, not the eyes of someone in shock. Not glassy or unfocused, but calm in a way that was somehow more unsettling than panic would have been. There was something behind them, some careful, quiet thing, like a door that was shut but not locked. "Are you hurt?" he asked. He looked down at her feet. The soles were cut and dirty, a thin line of dried blood tracing the arch of her left foot. "Can you tell me your name?" She held his gaze for a long moment. Not confused, not frightened, just measuring something. Then she drew a slow breath, straightened slightly, as if she had come to a private decision, and said it clearly and without hesitation. Eleanor. Eleanor Marsh. Cal didn't recognize the name right away. It took him another few seconds of looking at her face, at the dried mud and the bare feet and that unsettling stillness, to feel the first faint edge of it. Something he'd heard on the radio a month ago. Something about a farm. A missing girl. He reached for his radio with a hand that wasn't quite steady. The dispatcher recognized the name before he'd even finished saying it. 30 seconds later, every officer in Harlan County was wide awake. Eleanor Marsh had been missing for exactly 30 days. Not 29. Not 31. 30 days to the hour, almost, as if whatever force had swallowed her up had set a timer and honored it with grim precision. She had vanished on a Tuesday evening in late September, in that narrow window of fading light between supper and full dark, when the sky turns the color of a bruise and the shadows between the trees lose their definition and become something else entirely. The last confirmed sighting of her was at 6:47 p.m. That was the timestamp on the motion-activated light above the chicken coop at the Marsh Farm on Doyle Road, just outside the small town of Crestfield. The light had a cheap security camera bolted beneath it, the kind sold in hardware stores for $40, its resolution just good enough to be frustrating. The footage showed Eleanor walking across the yard with a metal bucket swinging from her right hand, her hair pulled back, wearing her father's old flannel over a white thermal shirt. She set the bucket down, lifted the latch on the coop, and stepped inside. The camera's angle didn't cover the interior. 3 minutes later, the light clicked off on its timer. She never came back out. Or if she did, it was through a different door, into a part of the yard the camera couldn't see. Her boots were found the next morning, sitting side by side near the fence post at the edge of the property, where the mowed grass met the start of the tree line. They were placed too neatly to have been kicked off, toes pointing outward, laces still loosely tied, as though she had stepped out of them deliberately and set them down with care. Her bucket was nearby, still half full of feed that the chickens hadn't reached. There were no drag marks in the dirt. No broken branches along the tree line. No signs of a struggle anywhere in the yard, not so much as an overturned stone. The absence of evidence, as Detective Sandra Okafor would later note in her case file, was itself a kind of evidence. She just hadn't figured out what kind yet. The first 72 hours had the controlled chaos that serious missing persons cases always bring. State police were called in. Volunteers gathered in the parking lot of the Crestfield Baptist Church, 200 of them at the peak, some driven by genuine fear for a neighbor's child, others by the particular pull that tragedy has on small towns, the way it briefly dissolves the ordinary distances between people. They walked the woods in long lines, shoulder to shoulder, turning over deadfall and calling her name into the trees. Divers checked the creek that ran behind the Marsh property and the larger pond half a mile east. Cadaver dogs were brought out on day 3, worked through 6 hours of fields and timber, and found nothing. The story made regional news for 4 days. A school photo of Eleanor ran on the local stations. Dark eyes, a guarded almost smile, the kind of face the camera couldn't quite get comfortable with. Tips came in and were followed up and went nowhere. A trucker said he'd seen a girl matching her description near the highway. He hadn't. A woman in the next county called to report a suspicious van. It belonged to a florist. By day 10, the volunteers had stopped coming. By day 15, the state police had quietly reduced their involvement, the way institutions do when a case offers no purchase, no direction to push. The story had been replaced in the news cycle by a factory closure in the next county over, and then by the first frost of the season, and then by something else. The world moved the way the world does. But Dennis and Willa Marsh did not move. They sat in their farmhouse on Doyle Road and did not move at all, in the way of people who are afraid that motion itself might be a kind of surrender. Willa kept Eleanor's bedroom exactly as it was. Bed made, lamp on, the small ceramic horse on the windowsill facing outward toward the road. Dennis stopped eating regular meals and started spending long hours on the porch, watching the tree line with an expression that Sandra, when she came to re-interview him on day 18, couldn't quite categorize. It wasn't grief, exactly. It was something harder and more complicated than grief. Something that made her want to ask questions she didn't yet have grounds to ask. She wrote 3 words in her notebook after that visit and underlined them twice. Check the father. Asterisk. Detective Sandra Okafor had been with the Harlan County Sheriff's Department for 14 years. She had worked abductions, domestics, a double homicide that had taken 2 years to close. She was not someone who panicked, or who inflated her instincts into certainties before the evidence earned it. But she was also not someone who let go of a thread simply because it wasn't leading anywhere obvious. She pulled phone records that the initial canvas had overlooked. She re-interviewed 3 neighbors whose first statements had felt slightly too smooth, slightly too aligned. She drove Doyle Road at 6:47 in the evening, just to see what the light looked like, what you could see from the road, what you couldn't. She slept 3 hours a night and told herself it was enough. When the call came in at 5:23 a.m., a trucker en Route 9, a girl on the road, a name that made the dispatcher's voice go strange. Sandra was already in her car, coffee going cold in the cup holder, a map of Harlan County spread across the passenger seat with 3 locations circled in red ink. She had been about to drive out to check something. She wasn't sure what yet. Just a feeling, the way a tooth aches before it breaks. She put the car in drive and headed for the hospital, and she told herself to be relieved. The girl was alive. That was what mattered. That was everything. But the thread was still there, loose and persistent at the edge of her mind, and Sandra Okafor had never in 14 years been able to leave a loose thread alone. Eleanor was physically unharmed. That was the first thing the hospital confirmed, and the news moved through Crestfield like a current, through the diner on Main Street where the morning regulars were just settling in with their first cups, through the Baptist church where Pastor Gideon happened to be unlocking the front doors, through the Marsh farmhouse on Doyle Road, where Willa received the call standing in her kitchen and had to sit down on the floor because her legs simply stopped working. The town exhaled. You could almost hear it. 30 days of held breath releasing all at once. A collective loosening of something that had been wound very tight. Sandra arrived at Harlan County General 20 minutes after the call came in, before Eleanor's parents, before the state police liaison, before the victim's advocate who had been assigned to the case in week 1 and had since moved on to other files. She badged her way past the desk and found Eleanor in a curtained bay at the end of the corridor, sitting upright on the hospital bed with a thin blanket across her lap and an untouched cup of juice on the tray beside her. A nurse named Patrice was wrapping her left foot in clean gauze, working quietly, murmuring reassurances that Eleanor didn't seem to need. Sandra stood in the gap in the curtain for a moment before announcing herself, and in that moment she simply looked. Eleanor Marsh was 16 years old, 5'4", with the kind of stillness about her that didn't belong in a hospital bay under fluorescent lights after 30 days missing. She wasn't rocking or trembling or staring at the middle distance the way survivors sometimes did, their minds hovering just outside their bodies while the body itself went through the motions. She was present. Fully, deliberately present. Her dark eyes moving around the room with a quiet attentiveness, cataloging, processing. When Patrice said something gentle about the cuts on her feet, Eleanor looked down at them briefly, nodded, and looked back up. No wince. No tears. Just acknowledgement and adjustment, the way someone moves through a task they have already mentally completed. Sandra introduced herself and pulled a chair close to the bed. Eleanor watched her sit down with that same careful attention. "I'm not going to push you," Sandra said. "You've been through something, and we have time. But anything you feel ready to share is going to help us." Eleanor nodded. Then she began to talk. She said she had been kept in a basement. The floor was concrete, she said, and there was a small window near the ceiling that was covered with a piece of plywood nailed from the outside. There was a cot, a bucket, a single bare bulb on a cord. The man brought her food twice a day, mostly canned things, sometimes bread. She didn't know his name. She described him carefully. Heavy-set, somewhere in his 50s, a gray beard that was longer on one side than the other, thick hands, a way of breathing through his nose that she could hear before she could see him coming down the stairs. He drove a dark truck, she said. She thought it was a Ford. She never saw the license plate. She didn't know where the house was. She had been taken in the dark, she said, and had no sense of direction or distance. The surrounding area was heavily wooded. She could hear trees moving in the wind constantly, and at night, when it was quiet, there was a water tower somewhere not too far off that made a low groaning sound when the wind came from the north. She had lain on her cot and listened to it most nights instead of sleeping. She escaped, she said, on the 30th night. He had left the plywood panel slightly loose after checking the window latch, just slightly, just enough. She had worked at it for 3 hours with a piece of wire she'd found in the seam of the cot's frame. When it gave, she climbed out into the cold dark and ran toward the only light she could see, which turned out to be the ambient glow of the Route 9 corridor about 2 miles through the trees. It was a clean story. Detailed without being excessive. Emotional in the right places without tipping into performance. The kind of account that moved in a straight line from beginning to end without doubling back on itself, without the small contradictions and hesitations that genuine traumatic memory almost always produces. The way survivors will suddenly stop and say no, wait, it was the other hand, or I think it was raining, or maybe that was a different day. Eleanor's story had none of that texture. It arrived fully formed, each piece fitting the next with a neatness that Sandra recognized from a different context entirely. It was the neatness of a story that had been prepared. She didn't say that. Not then. She held Eleanor's hand and told her she was safe, and she meant every word of it. She watched Patrice finish wrapping the foot and listened to Eleanor answer 2 more follow-up questions with the same composed precision. She smiled when Eleanor finally picked up the juice and took a sip. She made the right sounds and asked the right gentle questions and wrote things in her notebook in her small, careful handwriting. But underneath all of it, quiet and insistent as a second heartbeat, that loose thread was pulling. Because Sandra had sat across from a lot of people in 14 years. Victims and witnesses and people who were both and people who were neither. And she knew the difference between someone who was holding themselves together and someone who simply had nothing to hold together against. Eleanor Marsh did not look like someone bracing against the memory of 30 days in a basement. She looked like someone who had made a decision, and was now watching carefully to see how it landed. Sandra closed her notebook, capped her pen, and squeezed Eleanor's hand once more before standing. "You did so well," she said. "We're going to figure this out." Eleanor looked up at her with those steady dark eyes and said thank you in a voice that was perfectly, quietly controlled. Sandra walked out of the bay and stood in the corridor for a moment with her back against the wall and her eyes on the ceiling. Around her the hospital moved and beeped and murmured. Down the hall, she could hear Willa Marsh's voice. The raw, fractured sound of a mother who had just seen her daughter's face after 30 days of not knowing. Sandra let that sound settle. Then she took out her notebook, turned to a fresh page, and wrote 4 words this time, pressing harder than usual, the pen leaving grooves in the paper beneath. Who taught her that story? The gas station camera almost didn't matter. That was the thing Sandra kept coming back to in the days that followed. How close they had come to never finding it at all. The station itself, a sun-bleached shell with 2 working pumps and a hand-lettered sign advertising live bait, sat at the intersection of Route 9 and County Road 7, 11 miles from where Cal Briggs had found Eleanor standing in the road. It wasn't on any of the routes Sandra had initially mapped. It wasn't flagged in the original canvas because no one had thought to look 11 miles in that direction. The search had radiated outward from the Marsh farm, not from the point of recovery. It was only because Sandra had spent the better part of 2 days after Eleanor's return driving every road that connected to Route 9 within a 15-mile radius, stopping at every building with any kind of exterior camera, showing her badge and asking the same patient question, that she found herself standing in the back office of that Shell station at 9:30 on a Thursday morning, watching grainy footage on a monitor that was older than some of her colleagues. The timestamp read 3:04 a.m., nearly 2 full hours before Cal had hit his brakes. The truck came into frame from the left, moving slowly, the way vehicles do when a driver is uncertain of their surroundings or watching for something specific. It pulled up to the edge of the camera's range and stopped, not at the pumps, just at the periphery, as if the driver had pulled over to check a phone or consult a map. The camera was mounted high, angled down at the pump island, so the truck was caught at the far edge of the frame, partially obscured, the image degraded by distance and the particular graininess of cheap night vision recording. But it was enough. A dark pickup, crew cab, American-made. The driver was a shadow behind the wheel, unreadable. The passenger was not. Sandra leaned forward in the office chair until she was close enough to the monitor that she could see the individual pixels breaking the image apart. She watched it 4 times without speaking. The station owner, a heavy-set man named Gerald who smelled of motor oil and had been courteous enough to leave her alone with the footage, was visible through the office window, pretending to restock the candy rack and doing a poor job of not watching her. On the 4th viewing, Sandra said the word out loud, quietly, to no one in particular. The girl in the passenger seat was leaning toward the driver. Her head was tilted slightly, her body angled inward, the posture of someone sharing a private moment rather than enduring a difficult one. And her face, grainy, distant, half lit by whatever faint light reached the cab, was arranged in an expression that Sandra had been looking at for 30 days in school photos and flyers and the memory of a mother's description. Dark eyes, a guarded almost smile. Eleanor Marsh. Alive and present and apparently, in this moment captured at 3:04 in the morning on a road 11 miles from where she would soon be found standing barefoot in the headlights of an approaching truck, laughing. Not the laughter of someone relieved to be free. Not the loose, fractured laughter of shock or exhaustion, which Sandra had seen before and which looked nothing like joy. This was something softer and more specific. A shared laugh, the kind that passes between 2 people who have a history together, a private language, an inside of something that no one else is on the outside of. Sandra sat back in the chair and looked at the frozen frame for a long time. She had built her career on not jumping to conclusions. On letting evidence lead rather than following instinct to a destination and working backward. It was the discipline that had made her good at this work and occasionally maddening to work alongside, because she would not be rushed and she would not be certain before certainty was earned. She applied that discipline now, deliberately and carefully, the way you apply pressure to a wound. But the facts were assembling themselves into a shape she couldn't ignore. Eleanor had not been found near the point of escape. She had been delivered, or had walked herself. to a road 2 miles from that gas station, 2 hours after this footage was recorded. Which meant the truck had been in this area at 3 in the morning. Which meant whoever was driving it had been with Eleanor at 3 in the morning and had not, apparently, been holding her against her will at that particular moment. Which meant the clean story with its prepared neatness and its water tower groaning in the north wind and its plywood panel worked loose with a piece of wire, that story had a seam in it. And Sandra had just found the seam. She asked Gerald to pull the highest resolution still he could manage from that frame and print it. While the ancient printer in the corner labored over the image, she went back to the footage and this time watched not Eleanor but the truck. She noted what she could make out of the make and the profile. She noted the side mirror, which caught a sliver of light and revealed, just barely, a shape, a small decal or sticker of some kind on the lower corner of the rear window. She noted the rear bumper, which had a slight crumple on the passenger side, the particular geometry of a low-speed parking lot collision that had been ignored rather than repaired. She took the printed still, which was blurry and too dark but still more than nothing, and drove back to the department. She pulled the vehicle database and began the slow, methodical work of cross-referencing dark pickup trucks registered in Harlan County, crew cab, American-made, Ford or possibly Chevy, against the small and unpromising list of leads the original investigation had generated. It took most of the afternoon. She ordered a sandwich from the deli across the street and ate half of it without tasting it. At 4:47 p.m., a name surfaced. Cody Pruitt, 24 years old. A dark blue Ford F-150, crew cab, registered to an address on Doyle Road. No criminal record, not even a traffic citation. He worked part-time at the farm supply store in Crestfield and, according to his social media profiles, which Sandra spent 40 minutes reading with the focused attention of someone studying a foreign language, spent a lot of time outdoors. Hunting, fishing, the kind of life that leaves calluses and keeps irregular hours. Sandra sat very still with that name on her screen for a moment. Then she pulled up a county map and typed in his address. Doyle Road. She knew that road. She had driven it dozens of times in the past month. She knew the farmhouse at number 412, the rusted mailbox, the motion-activated light above the chicken coop. She knew the fence post where a pair of boots had been found placed too neatly, toes pointing outward, laces still loosely tied. Cody Pruitt lived at number 381 on Doyle Road. 4 houses down from the Marsh farm. Sandra closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. A habit she'd developed years ago, a small internal reset between the moment of discovery and the moment of action. Then she opened them, reached for her phone, and made 2 calls. One to the state police liaison. One to a judge she trusted. Her hand was steady. Her voice was steady. Everything was steady except the thing moving fast and certain beneath it all. The thing that had been pulling at her for days like a loose thread finally coming free, unraveling the careful fabric of a story that had never quite been true. The truth, when it finally came, did not arrive with the drama that 30 days of fear and searching might have demanded. There was no confrontation in a rain-soaked parking lot, no moment where someone broke down and confessed with their face in their hands. It came the way most truths do in Sandra's experience, incrementally, reluctantly, one small admission pulling the next loose until the whole structure gave way and what was underneath was simply there, ordinary and devastating in equal measure. Cody Pruitt answered the door on the first knock. Sandra had brought Deputy Aaron Fells with her, and they had a patrol unit parked at the end of the driveway as a precaution, but she had specifically asked everyone to stay back and stay quiet. She didn't want this to look like a raid. She wanted it to look like a conversation, because in her experience, the difference between those two things determined what you walked away with. Cody was 24 years old with no record and no apparent instinct for self-preservation. He opened the door in a gray sweatshirt and work boots, a half-eaten bowl of cereal in his hand, and when Sandra showed her badge his face did something complicated and then went very still. He knew. Of course he knew. He'd been waiting for this knock since 5 a.m. the previous morning, when he had watched Eleanor walk away from his truck and disappear into the dark tree line above Route 9. Sandra could see it in the set of his jaw. Not the stillness of innocence but the stillness of someone who has spent 24 hours deciding what to say and still hasn't quite decided. "Can we come in?" Sandra said. He stepped back and let them in. The inside of the house was small and clean in the way of someone who lives alone and has learned to impose order as a substitute for company. There were hunting photographs on the walls, a pair of muddy boots by the back door, a shelf of paperback novels above the television. Sandra sat down across from him at the kitchen table and put her notebook flat on the surface between them, open to a blank page, pen resting on top. She didn't reach for it. She just let it sit there, present and patient. "Tell me about Eleanor," she said. And here is where Cody Pruitt surprised her. He didn't lawyer up immediately, though she told him he could. He didn't perform outrage or confusion. He looked at the table for a long moment, and when he looked up there was something in his face that she hadn't expected. Not calculation, but something closer to exhaustion. The particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a weight they were never equipped to carry and has finally, with something like relief, set it down. He had met Eleanor 11 months ago, he said. She used to walk past the farm supply store on her way home from school. And one afternoon in November she had come in out of the rain and they had talked for 2 hours about nothing in particular. Books. Mostly, and the particular misery of Crestfield winters. And he had thought about that conversation for weeks afterward before he allowed himself to understand what it meant. He knew the age difference was a problem. He said that plainly, without excuses, which Sandra noted. He knew her father would never accept it. Eleanor had told him about Dennis Marsh early on. About the temper that had a long fuse and a catastrophic end. About the way the house on Doyle Road had rules that were less rules than they were walls. About the bruise she'd worn under her left sleeve for 2 weeks in March that she'd told everyone at school was from a fall. Cody had wanted to report it. Eleanor had begged him not to. She said it would make everything worse, and she said it with the certainty of someone who had done the math on that particular equation many times before. So they had built their hidden world instead. Notes left under a loose board on the fence post, the same fence post where her boots would later be found. Stolen hours on his lunch break. 2 afternoons a week when her parents thought she was at her friend Danny's house and she was actually sitting in the cab of his truck on a logging road 3 miles east of town. Just talking, just being somewhere that didn't have walls. He loved her, he said. Sandra didn't doubt it. Love didn't require wisdom or good judgment, and it didn't immunize anyone against doing something that caused tremendous harm while meaning to cause none. The night Eleanor disappeared, Dennis Marsh had found a text on her phone. Sandra had suspected this, had circled it in her mind as a possibility since day 18, since the visit to the farmhouse where Dennis's expression had that hard, complicated quality that didn't fit simple grief. The text wasn't explicit, but it was tender, and tender was enough. He had confronted Eleanor with a rage that left its mark. Not just the bruising on her arms that the hospital had photographed and that Sandra's report would make very hard to ignore, but something deeper and less visible, a final closing of a door that Eleanor had been trying to hold open. She had called Cody from the barn at 6:30 p.m., 17 minutes before the motion-activated camera caught her crossing the yard. She told him what had happened. She told him she wasn't going back inside that house. Her voice, Cody said, was very quiet and very certain, and he had never heard her sound like that before. Not afraid, not desperate, just decided. She told him to meet her at the tree line at the back of the property in 20 minutes. He was there in 15. The boots by the fence post were Eleanor's idea. She had read enough news stories, she told Cody on the drive north, to know what an abduction scene was supposed to look like, and she wanted her father looking outward, at the woods, at the creek, at the highway, instead of inward, at himself and what he had done. She placed them carefully, toes out, laces loose. Then she walked into the tree line and didn't look back. They drove 60 miles north to a hunting cabin that belonged to a friend of Cody's who was out of state for the season. They stayed there for 30 days. Eleanor read. Cody cooked. They talked about what came next without ever quite arriving at an answer. Eleanor knew she couldn't stay hidden forever. She also knew she wasn't ready to walk back into whatever waited for her at home. So the days passed the way days do when you are suspended between the life you've left and the life you haven't yet figured out how to build. Slowly, quietly, with a kind of fragile peace that both of them understood wasn't permanent. On the 30th night, Eleanor told Cody she was ready. Not to go home, she was clear about that. But to surface. To stop being missing and start being whatever came next. Cody had driven her south through the dark, and somewhere on Route 9 she had asked him to pull over. She wanted to walk the last part, she said. She needed to arrive on her own terms. He had watched her cross the guardrail and disappear into the tree line and then sat in his truck for 20 minutes before he could make himself drive away. Sandra listened to all of it without interrupting. When Cody finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a crow was making noise in the field behind the house. The patrol unit was still at the end of the driveway. She picked up her pen and looked at him across the table. "You understood she was 16, she said. It wasn't a question. He met her eyes. "Yes," he said. She wrote it down. The aftermath arrived quietly, the way the end of things often does. Not with the crash and spectacle that 30 days of fear and searching might have earned, but with paperwork, and meetings in fluorescent-lit rooms, and the slow, unglamorous work of consequence finding its proper shape. Cody Pruitt was arrested on a Thursday afternoon, 2 days after Sandra sat across from him at his kitchen table and listened to him tell the truth with the exhausted relief of someone who had been holding their breath for a month. The charges were serious on paper: harboring a minor, obstruction of justice, contributing to the delinquency of a minor, and the district attorney's office handled them with the particular energy that cases involving missing children tend to generate, the kind of institutional momentum that is partly about justice and partly about the appearance of decisive action. His photograph appeared briefly on the regional news, which felt obscene to Sandra in a way she couldn't entirely articulate. He looked young in it. He looked exactly as young as he was. His attorney, a measured woman named Patricia Osei who Sandra had dealt with before and respected, argued with considerable force and some merit that Cody Pruitt had not stolen a child but had helped one survive an unsafe home. She submitted the hospital photographs of Eleanor's arms as part of the defense filing. She submitted school records showing 3 visits to the nurse's office in the previous academic year for injuries that had been logged as accidental. She submitted a statement from Eleanor herself, written in Eleanor's own handwriting, in the careful and precise prose of someone who had always used language as her most reliable tool, that described what life on Doyle Road had been, and what Cody Pruitt had been to her inside that life. Sandra read Eleanor's statement twice, alone in her office with the door closed, and then sat for a while looking at nothing in particular. Dennis Marsh was investigated. Sandra had filed for that separately, quietly, building the case with the same methodical patience she brought to everything, making sure that when it moved it would hold. The hospital photographs. The school records. A conversation with Eleanor's friend Donnie, who had been covering for Eleanor's absences for the better part of a year and who sat across from Sandra in the department interview room and cried steadily for 40 minutes while she described what she had seen and what she had been afraid to say. Dennis was not arrested immediately. These things moved slowly, especially in counties where everyone knew everyone and the line between a man's reputation and the presumption of his innocence was not always clearly drawn. But the investigation was opened, and it was documented, and Sandra made sure it was documented in a way that would not be easy to quietly close. Willa Marsh cooperated. That surprised some people and didn't surprise Sandra at all. Willa was not a woman who had chosen cruelty. She was a woman who had chosen a man and then spent 20 years making smaller and smaller accommodations to that choice until the accommodations had become the shape of her life. When Sandra sat with her in the living room of the farmhouse on Doyle Road, the same living room where the ceramic horse on Eleanor's windowsill still faced outward toward the road, Willa talked for 2 hours without being asked very much. She talked like someone emptying a room that had been cluttered for a long time. Sandra listened and took notes and didn't offer judgment, because judgment wasn't her job and because Willa Marsh was going to have enough of it from other directions before this was over. Eleanor was placed with her aunt, Rennie, in a town called Millhaven 2 counties east. Rennie was Willa's younger sister, a practical and warm woman who had a small house with a garden and a guest room with a window that faced the morning sun. Sandra had spoken with her twice before the placement was finalized, and both times had come away with the specific and uncommon feeling that Eleanor was going to land somewhere soft. Eleanor did not go back to the farmhouse on Doyle Road. Not once. She retrieved her things in 2 cardboard boxes that Willa packed and left on the front porch, and Rennie drove over and collected them without Eleanor having to get out of the car. The ceramic horse was in the first box, wrapped in a dish towel. Sandra knew this because Rennie mentioned it in passing during their second conversation, and Sandra had written it down in her notebook for reasons she couldn't fully explain, except that it seemed important to record the small things too. The things that told you who a person actually was, underneath everything that had happened to them. Cody Pruitt's case took 8 months to resolve. The charges were eventually reduced through a plea agreement that satisfied almost no one and was probably, Sandra thought, as close to proportionate as the available legal instruments allowed. He received 2 years of probation, community service, and a permanent mark on a record that had previously been clean. He lost his job at the farm supply store. He moved to a city 2 states away and, as far as Sandra could determine, rebuilt his life in the quiet way of someone who has learned an expensive lesson and is trying to spend the rest of their time more carefully. Sandra filed her final report on the case on a gray February morning, sitting at her desk with the last cold inch of her coffee beside her keyboard. She read it through once, methodical, thorough, precise, and then she signed it and submitted it and closed the file on her screen. She sat for a moment in the particular silence of a finished thing. She thought about Eleanor. She thought about the gas station footage. That brief, grainy laugh in a dark truck cab at 3 in the morning, and what it had meant and what it had cost to understand it. She thought about the boots placed too neatly by the fence post, toes pointing outward, the act of a girl who was not a victim of anything yet except a life she hadn't chosen. She thought about sitting across from Eleanor in that hospital bay, holding her hand, telling her she was safe, and how Eleanor had looked at her with those steady dark eyes and said thank you in a voice that gave nothing away, and how that composure, which Sandra had initially read as a flag, as a warning, was in fact just Eleanor being Eleanor. A girl who had learned very early that composure was armor, and had worn it so long it had become a second skin. And she thought about the statement. The one in Eleanor's handwriting. The careful, precise prose. The document that Patricia Osei had submitted as part of the defense filing and that Sandra had read twice alone in her office with the door closed. The last paragraph had stayed with her the way certain things do. Not as a thought you return to, but as something that has simply moved in and rearranged the furniture. "I didn't disappear," Eleanor had written. "I left. There is a difference, and the difference matters, and I need someone to understand that I knew exactly what I was doing and exactly why I was doing it. I was not lost. I was not taken. I was a person in an impossible place who found the only door that was open and walked through it. I am sorry for the fear I caused. I am not sorry for leaving. I would leave again." Sandra had read that paragraph and thought about all the searches. The volunteers in the Baptist church parking lot. The divers in the creek. The cadaver dogs working through 6 hours of fields and timber. 200 people looking through the woods for someone who wasn't in the woods at all, who was 60 miles north, sitting in a warm cabin, reading a book, breathing air that didn't have her father in it. She thought about how the town had grieved and mobilized and eventually moved on, and how none of that collective machinery had ever paused to ask the question that mattered most. Not where is she, but why did she go? Not what happened to her, but what was happening to her. The difference between those questions was the difference between a search and an understanding, and Crestfield, like most places, had known how to do the first and had never quite learned how to do the second. Sandra gathered her things, put on her coat, and walked out of the department into the gray February morning. The air was cold and smelled like coming snow. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, hands in her pockets, looking at nothing in particular. Somewhere 2 counties east, in a house with a garden and a window that faced the morning sun, Eleanor Marsh was beginning whatever came next. Sandra hoped it was quiet. She hoped it had good light. She hoped Eleanor was reading something she had chosen herself, in a room with a door that locked from the inside, a small and specific kind of freedom that some people went their whole lives without ever having, and that Eleanor Marsh, at 16 years old, had been willing to disappear to find. She turned up her collar against the cold and walked to her car. Some cases closed. Some cases just stopped. This one, she thought, was somewhere in between.